Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and welcome to the second video in the introduction to my mixing tutorial series. In this video, I'll just be sharing with you a few tips and things that I think you should know before getting into the rest of the tutorial. Now, this isn't going to be your typical mixing tips video where I just throw a bunch of miscellaneous information at you. In this video, I will only be sharing tips with you that apply to mixing as a whole, and tips that I think are very, very important, along with some tips that are directly related to the rest of this tutorial. So I definitely recommend that you give this video a watch through and just kind of hear what I have to say. So first off, I kind of want you to forget everything that you think you know about mixing. Now, I don't really mean to completely forget it, but just for now, kind of push it to the back of your mind. And the reason for this is that what you've learned and what you've read on other tutorials probably isn't wrong. It's probably not bad advice or anything, but it's quite likely that you kind of learned it out of context or without context, or it might not have just been presented in a very good way. And this is what I think causes a lot of confusion for beginners, is just the way that a lot of mixing advice is presented. You know, a lot of the time, various articles and things don't go into a whole lot of depth about why they advise you do something like that. So you just have this piece of advice with no real information behind it. And if you're into electronic music, many of the top search results for mixing provide techniques that are specifically for mixing acoustic music that aren't necessarily entirely relevant to electronic music, especially when they get more specific. So, if you're a complete beginner, you probably don't have that much to push to the back of your mind. If you've kind of done a lot of research but are really confused about the mixing process and everything, then I think it will really help you to kind of push all that to the back of your mind for now and start fresh, because that's the whole point of this tutorial, is to clear up a bunch of stuff that can be confusing if you've just read a lot of mixing tips and stuff like that online. So, after you've watched through this whole tutorial series, you can kind of bring that stuff out from the back of your mind and take a look at it and decide, okay, is this relevant to my mixing, or how will this be relevant to my mixing? And you can just take a better look at that advice and decide if it will fit into your production or if it won't. So the next bit of advice I have for you is to watch through this whole tutorial in order. And that's because the whole reason behind me making this tutorial was to present all this mixing information in a different way than a lot of other tutorials do it, to make the learning process a lot more organized, to make it all a lot more clear, so that hopefully, you won't be confused at all. And I definitely recommend you do all of the exercises for each step as well, just so you can, really make sure you're getting some practice, training your ears, and just locking down that information to know that you are ready to move on to the next step. Because, again, the whole point of this tutorial is to break things down into an order that is easy to learn and makes sense, so that you aren't becoming overwhelmed and trying to do too many things all at once, when really you need to, take a step back and learn each part on its own to fully understand it. So even if you think you know a certain section of the tutorial in depth already, I may mention certain tools or different techniques, or just give a different take on that information than you've read before that could be helpful to you. So I definitely do recommend that you watch the whole tutorial in the order that I have presented it. And the worst case scenario is you end up spending some time just reviewing stuff that you already do know in depth. So my next tip for you is to keep your plugins simple for now. There's a common misconception that people will get better mixes by using more expensive or better plugins. And I'm not going to say that this is a complete lie, but as a beginner, the chances are your mixes will sound similar regardless of the plugins you use. The more expensive plugins might even cause a little bit of extra confusion because of their additional functionality. So I do recommend you keep things simple for now while you're learning. And doing this will also help you, save money and just not overcrowd your plugins folder. Because, later on when you have a better idea of the mixing process and know what kind of tools you do need, you'll be able to get only those tools that you do need instead of just as many more expensive mixing plugins as possible. I know that I personally still use primarily mixing plugins that come with FL Studio, and I feel like I'm getting some very decent mixes, and I don't feel limited by these plugins too much. When I do, it's in very rare and very specific cases. So, chances are if you're having trouble mixing, it's not the plugins, it's just that you need a bit more practice and maybe a bit more knowledge of the techniques and all that stuff. So, your workstation software should have everything you need to, get some decent mixes. So you don't need any expensive plugins starting off, but what I do recommend you have is a reliable monitoring system. A good set of monitors with a properly treated room or a good set of headphones. And this is because it's very important that you are able to clearly hear your music while mixing it. So if you're mixing on bad quality speakers, if you're mixing on speakers with a limited frequency range, it's kind of like, an artist, a painter, painting in a dark room. So, they can't really see the colors they're using, so they can't make proper judgments on whether those are the right colors and all that. And, this applies to mixing as well. If you can't hear things properly, you're going to have a hard time making decisions on whether any sounds are too harsh or any sounds are too loud or stuff like that. So you don't need the, best speakers in the world to get a good mix. You just need a decent set of monitors or headphones that have a pretty flat frequency response and are familiar to your ears. And there is a section of Beat School that's dedicated towards hardware where you can find out a little bit more information about this. I did want to touch on it because it is very important to mixing. You want to be able to hear everything properly. That said, you can get a good mix on, any sound system. You're just going to have to know what you're doing a lot more, and it's going to be a lot harder. It's going to be more challenging. So if you're stuck using, a certain set of speakers, it's not the end of the world, but it would be much better if you could get either a set of monitors or headphones if you're stuck on a low budget. So the next thing isn't really a tip, but it's something that I think you should know. And this is the fact that mixing is an art, and there are no rules. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't seem to really understand. Mixing is just as much an artistic process as writing the song. Mixing a song a certain way can enhance the mood that your song is expressing, and different people will have varying opinions on the mix of a song based on their personal preferences. So if you have a song that is very fast-paced, it's a dance song, and you want to get the energy up, you're probably going to have your hi-hats be pretty present in the mix, pretty apparent, because the rhythm of the hi-hats can really help bring out the energy in a track. But at the same time, if you're mixing a more down-tempo, relaxed track that you just want people to listen to and relax, having your hi-hats just as loud will probably not be appropriate. In that kind of track, really present hi-hats might sound out of place, and they might throw off the mix. But in some cases, you may want to have the hi-hats more loud in a down-tempo track, and that might just be your preference. I know that I personally kind of like some rawness in a track. There are so many people out there who want really clean productions. They want everything to be nice and crisp and clean. But I actually don't really care that much for these hyper clean mixes. I'd rather there be some grit, maybe a little bit of muddiness. Not too much, but a little bit, or, just a little bit of character to the track, and not have everything really clean and really perfect. And, that's for dance music, aggressive dance music, like, hardstyle, dubstep, all that. For acoustic recordings and other kind of recordings, I definitely do appreciate a much cleaner mix with those. So, it's just an art. There are no rules. And that's something that I think people really should understand a little bit more. So the next piece of information that I want to share with you is along similar lines as the previous one. And that is that there is no formula for a good mix. Many people search for a formulaic method of mixing, and some people even write tutorials that are very formula-based. They tell you to set your kick so it peaks at -3 decibels, or they'll tell you to set it so it's -6 decibels RMS. And they give you all this technical information that sounds like you're doing some process in a science laboratory. And you have to follow a certain recipe, otherwise, the outcome is going to be completely wrong. And, that's not the case. The truth is that there is no formula for mixing. There can't be a formula for mixing. And, unless you're using the same exact sounds to create the same mood for the same genre in every song, you'll probably be mixing a bit differently every time. And in some cases, you might be mixing quite a bit differently. So you definitely have to use your ears and take things on a case-by-case basis when you're mixing, if you want to get truly good mixes in general. And don't be afraid to trust your judgment. Mixing shouldn't be intimidating. It's really pretty simple if you don't worry about it too much. If you have bad judgment right now, if you can't quite hear things the way you should, what you really need is just practice. Keep practicing, and as you practice, your mixing skills and your ability to hear things will improve. Now, if you really don't trust your ears and you really don't trust your abilities to mix completely on your own based on what you hear, then my advice to you would be to use a reference track. And this is a technique that, as long as you're paying attention, should help you get your mixes sounding about right in terms of overall frequency balance and all that kind of stuff. And essentially the idea is that you'll take a mix that you like and you'll try to achieve that mix with your own song. And using a reference track is definitely the best thing to do if you do need a little bit more guidance or some guidelines on how to mix, because it can help you get your levels right and kind of get used to how things should sound on your monitors or your headphones. So there will be a lot more information about using a reference track to mix in the first official part of this tutorial, which is called leveling. So you don't have to go look that up now or anything. I'll definitely be explaining that in a decent amount of detail at that point. So my next piece of advice for you is to not do anything unless you know why you are doing it. And the reason I mention this is that there are a lot of specific tips out there for how to get a great mix, or how to improve this sound or that sound. But following many of these tips could actually cause your mix to sound worse in some cases if you don't fully understand the context. And a very good example of this is with compression. Compression is always talked about whenever you ask about how to get a better mix or anything like that. And I've reviewed people's mixes before. They've sent me the project files, and I've seen cases where they have a compressor on some tracks, or they'll even have a compressor on every track, and sometimes the compressor actually isn't doing anything at all, or in other times it's just squishing the sound way too much. So it's pretty obvious that these guys don't really know why they're using that compressor, and they're just using it because somebody said that they should use a compressor. I personally don't use compression all that much, and that's partially because I use a lot of distortion in my sound design. But, the point here is that you should only incorporate a certain tool or a certain technique if you need to in order to fix a problem or to achieve a desired sound in your mix. And this applies to every aspect of mixing, not just compression. Compression just happens to be the most common example of this that I've experienced. So you really should have a reason behind any compression, any EQ, and anything like that. And this is something that I'll go into more depth on in each part. I'll explain not only the techniques, but I'll also explain when you would utilize them, why you would utilize them, and give some examples to help you be able to take things on a case-to-case basis and be able to know when you need to compress a sound or when you don't need to, and all that kind of stuff. So my next piece of advice here is don't be a perfectionist. Now, if you're a beginner, I would really suggest you be much less of a perfectionist, because it's a lot better to get practice by mixing multiple songs from the start, rather than obsessing on one song for too long. Mixing a completely new song from scratch will just give you much better experience than focusing on a single song and trying to make it perfect. And each mix will be better than your last mix, and you'll learn how to incorporate these techniques better and all that. Whereas if you're obsessing on one mix as a beginner, you might end up going in circles, boosting the bass of your kick and then boosting the bass of everything else and then boosting the higher end of everything else because now the bass is too loud. Or you might lower the volume of your kick because you think it sounds too loud, and then you lower the volume of the snare because now it sounds too loud, and then you just end up lowering the volume of everything. Now, I'm not saying this will definitely happen. I just wanted to provide an example of how you can kind of get caught in loops if you're obsessing way too much about a certain song, especially as a beginner, because, as a beginner, you're going to not have perfect mixes right away. It's going to take practice, and the practice you need really comes from mixing a bunch of songs rather than obsessing over a single song. And that's why I've included so many stems of my own songs for you to practice mixing on. And that kind of ties into the next advice I have for you, which is not to stress. Don't stress. Having a great mix is great, but that's really about it. In electronic music, there's a huge focus on the production quality right now. Everybody wants a perfect mix, and nobody is happy with their song unless it has one. And I think this is a really kind of a toxic state of mind. People are focusing so much more on the production quality than they are on the music, when the music is what really matters. And the truth is, a good song with an amateur mix is still a good song. And a boring song with an amazing mix is still a boring song. Your average listener will care much more about the composition than the sound quality. And if the quality of the music, the quality of the composition and all that is at a good level, the mix can actually be really quite rough and people will still want to listen to it. And if your goal is to be a producer who plays live shows or a DJ, the systems that you're going to be playing on are going to be so loud that, nobody's really going to be able to appreciate your beautifully perfect, awesome mix. And not only is the system going to be too loud for that, but the people listening at a club or a festival or a show or whatever, they aren't there to appreciate the pristine quality of your mix. They're there to dance, they're there to party, they're there to have a good time. And I really doubt anyone's going to refuse to dance and refuse to have a good time if, your mix is less than perfect. I mean, you can see how ridiculous that sounds. And yet people obsess so much about their mix quality. So what really matters is the energy you have in your tracks and the energy you have on stage. And there are just so many other factors that are so much more important than having a really good mix. And as long as you have a decent mix, you're fine. People are going to like your music. And it's not that hard to get a decent mix. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that mixing doesn't really matter and that you shouldn't care about it at all. I'm just trying to point out that this obsession with perfect mixes is kind of silly. It definitely is really great to have the ability to create amazing mixes. And that's definitely a good goal to have. But in the meantime, don't worry too much about your decent mixes or your good mixes. Don't hide your music from other people because you don't think your mixes are perfect yet. Don't let your less than perfect mixes prevent you from getting your name out there. I have a bunch of songs that I've released that really don't have that great of mixes. They're all right, but they really aren't anything special. But people still find my music and they still like it enough to post positive comments on YouTube, to download from SoundCloud, and even, buy it on iTunes and all that. Now, I will say that in some genres of music, the mix can be a lot more important, but it's still not worth stressing about. It's not worth preventing yourself from getting your name out there or any of that. So definitely have the goal of creating really awesome mixes, but just don't stress about it in the meantime. So the next tip I have for you is to not overcomplicate audio. Audio is pretty straightforward. There's no magic or anything like that involved. But people seem to really make things much more complicated than they actually are. And, I've read a lot of things on various forums that just are really weird and inaccurate about how sound works. And this is why I've included some technical videos in this series, which are all of the sound explained videos. These videos will help you get a better idea of how audio works from a technical viewpoint so that hopefully you'll be able to not get caught up in that sort of thing. So I definitely do recommend you watch all of the sound explained videos, even though they are a bit, maybe not the most interesting things. So the second last piece of advice I have for you is don't expect mastering to save you. From what I've read online, it seems that a lot of people seem to think that mastering is required to get a good quality sound. But the truth is, with a good mix, you can get a really great quality without any mastering at all. And as a beginner, that's really what you should aim for. And this is because mastering really deals with subtleties. It deals with very slight and subtle adjustments to help bring the song to its full potential. But if you're not really able to deal with these subtleties in mixing and get a really great quality mix, you're not going to be able to do it any better mastering. So really, you need to just focus your time and your effort on always trying to achieve a better and better mix until you're at a point where you think that your mixes are just great. Because until that point, you probably won't be able to fully understand the subtleties required to get a really great master. You can still definitely have a simple mastering chain just to help you get the final loudness of your track about equal with, professional releases. But other than that, you should definitely be focusing on the mix. Because really, anything that mastering could do to a track, to enhance a track, you could do even better at the mixing stage. So definitely try to mix your best instead of thinking, mastering will just fix up any problems you have. Or, mastering will just make my track sound professional. Because even if you send your track to a professional mastering engineer, it will help. They will help your song to sound as good as possible. But there's still so much more power you have at the mixing stage. And if you mess up something pretty bad in the mixing stage, it's going to be a lot harder to get the final song sounding as good even with mastering. So the final advice I have for you here is to practice. Just like everything else, it takes practice to start getting great mixes. Your ears need to be trained to listen for certain things, which It really just takes time. No matter how many articles you read, no matter how much time you put into studying mixing, you have to have that practice to really start getting good mixes. You'll probably need quite a bit of practice. You'll probably need to mix quite a few tracks before your mixes start sounding really good. And this is why I've included exercises in this tutorial that are designed to help you train your ears and just get a lot of practice mixing songs. So if you've downloaded this tutorial series, you'll have those. If you haven't downloaded it, the link will be in the description, and so you can check that out.